right, so welcome to Reason and Rationality, a summer program where high school students learn about philosophy, politics, economics, and ethics through cordial, lively, or as we say, convivial discussion. We're here for the summer 2025 program at Swarthmore, and we're going to be hosting a discussion-style debate on whether we have souls. But before we lay down some preliminaries, I thought we'd just say a little bit about who we are, the participants in this debate. So I'm Joe Schmid. I'm an upcoming third-year PhD student in the philosophy department at Princeton University. And yeah, that's a little bit about me.
My name is Flo. I am a fifth-year PhD student in the philosophy department at Harvard. And
I'm Noah. I'm an incoming PhD student in philosophy at Princeton.
I'm Amos. I'm about to start my master's in philosophical theology at Oxford.
Awesome. Okay, so now some preliminaries I want to get down on the table before we start the debate. One is a caveat. So you shouldn't infer our actual beliefs from what we're going to be saying and arguing up here tonight. We kind of collectively agreed to assign ourselves certain views, but some of our actual views might diverge from the views that we are defending. So I'll just say that. Each of us could capably defend the views on offer. The second thing that I want to say is we should probably get some definitions on the table. So the first definition is physicalism, and we've written that up on the board for you guys in case you want to look at it throughout the debate. Physicalism is the view that everything is physical. Now, something is physical just in case either it's included in our best theories of physics, or it's built up out of those things. So physical things include things like particles and waves and radiation, which are recognized in our best physical theories, but physical things also include tables and chairs and organisms and whatnot. And these things are ultimately built up out of those fundamental particles and waves, perhaps. Now, as philosophers sometimes put it, a chair is like reducible to a particular arrangement of particles, or it's like nothing over and above particles arranged a certain way. That's how the physicalist views everything. Everything is either, fundamental particles or maybe waves, or it's ultimately constructed up out of arrangements of those things. We'll also probably talk about physical facts at certain points in our debate tonight. A physical fact is a fact about physical entities or physical properties that they have, properties that scientists study, like mass and charge and things like that. A non-physical fact is a fact about non-physical entities or non-physical properties. So physicalists think that all facts are physical facts. Dualists, as I'm about to define, they think that's wrong. They maintain that there are some non-physical facts. You'll also sometimes hear us say physicalism and materialism. We're going to use those interchangeably. The next thing that I want to define is dualism. So that's another thesis that's going to be represented tonight. Dualism says, yeah, there are physical things, but minds are not physical. Instead, they're non-physical things, distinct in kind from physical things. Hence the dual in dualism, right? It says that there are two fundamentally different kinds of things. Physical things, like tables and chairs, and non-physical things, like minds, which harbor consciousness and conscious experience. Okay, a few other things that I want to lay down. Firstly, we're going to talk about minds throughout this discussion. Minds are just things which think, experience, reason, feel, love. That's what a mind is. Now, both physicalists and dualists believe that there are minds. They think that there are thinking things, things which believe, things which have experience, and so on, and we are all among them. The question is whether minds are physical. That's what we're debating tonight. The physicalist says yes, the dualist says no. And we're going to also be talking about souls. Now, a soul is just a non-physical mind. Okay, so dualists then believe in souls. Physicalists don't. Okay, so those are some of the preliminaries that I wanted to get on the table. I'll say something about the structure of the debate. So we'll hopefully get through 4 arguments in total, 2 for dualism and 2 for physicalism. Flo and I have been assigned to defend physicalism, so we've got the physicalists on this side. We probably should have written physicalism on this side, but that's okay. We don't have foresight here at Reason and Rationality. That was a joke. Noah and Amos have been assigned to defend dualism. Okay, we'll first start with an argument for dualism, then an argument for physicalism, and we'll sort of just like bounce back and forth. The style is going to be, as I said, a discussion-style informal debate. We kind of just want to give you guys a glimpse into what it looks like in the lounge when philosophers, grad students just kind of debate these topics and talk with one another. In terms of time, it's either going to be a 75-minute debate together with 45 minutes or so of Q&A, or maybe a 90-minute debate plus 30 minutes of Q&A. We'll see. The Q&A will not be recorded, so we're going to stop the recording right before the Q&A, just as we did at Princeton. So have the intellectual courage to ask anything you want. Clarificatory questions, objections, anything. Ask anything. It's not going to be seen anywhere but this room. Okay, so do you guys have anything to add by way of preliminary, or should we just get into the debate?
Yeah.
Okay, sweet. So, Noah, I think you're going to start off with an argument for dualism. So how about you start us off?
Okay. Well, I'm going to ask you to imagine a hypothetical vision scientist named Mary. Mary is really good at her job. In fact, she's so good that she has succeeded in learning every physical fact there is to know about color vision. She knows all the physical facts involved in the visual perception of color. But Mary has spent her entire life in a black and white room. So she herself has never seen colors, unless you count black and white as colors. But in particular, let's say she's never seen the color red. Now imagine that one day, Mary opens the door to her room and walks outside, and she sees a bright, ripe tomato. And Mary says to herself, now I know what it's like to see red. So here's a question. Has Mary learned something new? It seems like the obvious answer is yes, she has learned something new. Then we have to ask, okay, what kind of fact did Mary learn? Well, it can't be a physical fact because we already stipulated she knows all the physical facts. She knows all about how photons interact with the retina when somebody sees a color. She, even down to like all of the microphysical details of all the subatomic particles bumping into each other or attracting and repelling each other. She could tell you the whole story in physical terms about what happens when someone sees the color red. But if she learned something new, then whatever she learned couldn't have been one of those facts, right? Can't be a physical fact, so there must be some non-physical facts. That's my argument.
Yeah, I think I have a response. So I agree, it really seems like Mary learned something new. Before she knew what seeing red was like, she didn't know what seeing red was like. Now she knows what seeing red is like. But I don't know if it follows from that it's like a new kind of fact that she learned, especially like a non-physical fact, because there are other ways to learn new things. So for example, people often learn new abilities. We could, for example, imagine an expert in the mechanics of bicycles kept in a room with no bikes. They learn all the physical facts about bikes and how riding them works and how the various forces work. But when they exit their room and go on a bike, they can't do it until they practice a bit. And then they say, now I know how to ride a bike. It doesn't seem like we have to posit anything like non-physical in order to explain this. Somebody just has a new ability instead of learning a new fact. So what kind of ability would I say that learning what redness is like consists in? Well, you get all sorts of abilities once you're able to discriminate color by sight. Namely, you have the ability to discriminate between different colors. So now if you put a red apple in front of Mary, she can say, that's the same color as a tomato, whereas she wouldn't have been able to do that before. And so in particular, I think knowing what it's like to experience a certain color just consists in this ability to visually discriminate between things of different colors. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think I understand your proposal, but it doesn't seem quite right to me. It doesn't seem like Mary gains a new ability. It seems like the thing Mary gains knowledge of is just a fact. It's the fact that this is what it's like to see red. It's sort of a fact about conscious experience. Now, maybe that doesn't seem as clear to you. So here's maybe some scientific evidence that might support the distinction or support the idea that it's not merely an ability. There's a condition known as blind sight. in people who have blind sight, there's a portion of their visual field that, according to them, doesn't contain any sensory experience. So from their perspective, it's as if that region of their visual field is dark, right? But oddly enough, they're actually able to reliably make discriminations, visual discriminations in that area of the visual field. So, for example, scientists might ask them to guess the shape of an object that's in that portion of their visual field. And if they're forced to guess, they can do so reliably. That really looks like they have the ability to discriminate among different shapes visually, but still, they don't know, or they're not having a conscious experience, a conscious visual experience of those shapes. So, if there's a difference between having a visual experience of something and being able to visually discriminate between that thing and other things, then it seems like that's also going to be true of Mary. So there's going to be a difference between gaining the ability to discriminate visually between red and other colors and learning what it's like to see red.
I mean, I think that's a plausible response as far as it goes, but it seems quite limited. And the reason is that I think we can treat the knowledge that she gains, the new abilities that she gains, as a kind of cluster of abilities. Now, Flo was just giving one example, right? Discriminatory abilities. But she also gains lots of other abilities, which blindsight people don't have. So she gains the ability to remember seeing red. She gains the ability to now visually imagine in her mind's eye what red looks like. She gains all sorts of abilities in addition to the discriminatory abilities that you mentioned. And blindsight people arguably don't have that, especially if they've been their whole life without that kind of experience. So like maybe you're right that like, yeah, if you pick out one of these things, it doesn't fully account for what it seems like Mary learned. If it's a cluster of abilities, maybe actually we can account for it, and the blindsight case might not actually challenge that.
That's interesting. Well, tell me what you think about this. So here's an argument for thinking that what Mary learns has got to be a fact. It seems like once Mary sees red for the first time, she's in a position to draw new inferences. So she can reason in the following way. She can look at a ripe tomato and say, this is what it's like to see the color of a tomato. Now I know, because remember, she's knows all the physical facts about color and vision. So she knows that fire trucks are the same color as ripe tomatoes. So she reasons in this way. This is what it's like to see the color of a ripe tomato. Fire trucks are the same color as ripe tomatoes. Therefore, this is what it's like to see the color of a fire truck. Now, that seems like a valid inference, and it seems like it's one that Mary's in a position to make after she leaves the room, but not before, right? Because before she leaves the room, she doesn't know the first premise, that this is what it's like to see a ripe tomato. But inferences are, when you infer something from something else, you're inferring a proposition from some other propositions. Or another way to put that is a fact from some other facts. You take some facts that you know, and you infer some facts that you didn't know before.
I think that's an interesting response. Do you want to add?
I think there might be a parity here between what you're describing and other abilities. So, for example, what are two brands of bike?
Just say an e-bike and a regular bike.
An e-bike and a regular bike. Great. So, let's say that in my example, my bike scientist who knows all the physical facts that you can read from a book about bicycle riding, they do some practice and then they learn how to ride a normal bike. And then they say, this is how you ride a bike. Oh my gosh, I get it now. And then, they figure they know everything about bikes. So they know that there's not going to be anything like super fundamentally different about riding an e-bike. In fact, if anything, it'll be easier. So then, they can reason like, yeah, this is what it'll be like. This is also how you ride an e-bike. And they can do like this inference in abilities.
Yeah, I like that. But that's sort of making me think that when I say this is how you ride a bike, I'm actually expressing a fact. And I mean, think about it.
But a non-physical fact?
No, not necessarily. But remember, the question here is we're disagreeing. So Of course, my argument was Mary learned something new, and she already knew the physical facts, so she must have learned a non-physical fact. The response you and Joe are defending here is that what she learns is a new ability, not a new fact. So I'm just making points here about the difference between abilities and facts. I really like your bike example, but I wonder if that doesn't just show that when you say, this is how you ride a bike, you're actually expressing a fact. Because think about it. You could say, this is how you ride a bike, and be mistaken. Like you could be riding a scooter and say,
Secret training wheels.
yeah, exactly. You could say, this is how you ride a bike. And I could say, no, that's false. That is not how you ride a bike. But again, the only things that can be true and false are propositions. They're statements, claims about the way the world is. And, abilities aren't true or false. Only propositions are. And so that makes me think that I'm still pretty confident that
Can I respond to that?
yeah, of course.
Yeah, and so I think like Grant, that getting or like knowing how to do something involves a lot of knowledge of facts. But just to have the parity between the bike case and the Mary's room case, it seems like so maybe the person learns new physical facts when they learn how to ride a bike. But it seems like, things are still the same between the redness case and the riding a bike case. In the riding a bike case, I said that, this brilliant scientist learned pretty much everything you can learn about riding a bike from a book. And it seems intuitively plausible that is not going to give him the propositional knowledge required to ride a bike and know how to ride a bike. Just like how Mary can't read her vision textbooks and then learn what it's like to see red. And so the two cases seem perfectly similar in those regards. And so it seems like if nothing about the bike case makes me want to posit a non-physical fact that is date-barred, then the Mary's room case also shouldn't, tempt me to posit a non-physical fact.
Instead, it's just a new ability.
Yeah, and whatever also propositional knowledge is required or is involved in learning new abilities that you can't read from a book.
Right.
Yeah, I don't know. I'll have to think more about that.
Yeah, well, maybe I can give a second response. And before I do that, I'll just say, for the audience, for you guys out there, a little meta points about the dialectic. So Noah started off with an argument, the Mary's room argument, we can call it. And the argument is basically saying that from within her room, Mary knew all the physical facts, right? She knew all the facts involved in color vision. She knew all what happens down to the very level of the neurons and the acetylcholine traveling across the synaptic gap and all that stuff. But nevertheless, she had never actually seen the color red. And it seems like upon being released from her room and seeing a ripe tomato, it seems like she learns a new fact. But if she already knew all the physical facts involved in seeing the color red and she learned a new fact, it must be a non-physical fact. And so that would support non-physicalism or, dualism, as they're calling it. And then Flo pushed back by saying, well, actually, she doesn't learn a new fact when she leaves the room. She just learns a new ability. And we don't need to posit, some spooky non-physical facts in addition to the physical facts in order to account for what she learns. So that's just a little bit of stuff about the dialectic. Maybe I can now give an argument, or another objection to this style of argument. So maybe it's another reason why Mary didn't actually learn a new fact, but it's maybe going at it from a different perspective, from the ability response, we could call it. In particular, maybe Mary just learned an old fact in a new way, through a new perspective, or maybe under a different guise, or conceptualizing the same fact from a different vantage point, or something like that. Or maybe under a different description. So let me elaborate a little bit with an example. In ancient times, people saw a bright heavenly body in the morning, and they called it phosphorus. And they also saw a bright heavenly body in the evening, and they called it Hesperus. Now, as it turns out, Hesperus is actually the same heavenly body as phosphorus. They're both just Venus. Now, given that Hesperus and phosphorus are literally identical, the fact that Hesperus is a planet is very plausibly the same fact as the fact that phosphorus is a planet. But crucially, the former fact can be known, crucially, this one fact can be known in different ways or through different conceptualizations, right? One can know this fact through the kind of Hesperus description, or one can know it through a kind of phosphorus description. And we can imagine someone who knows that Hesperus is a planet, but they've never even heard the term phosphorus. And it may seem tempting to say that they learn a new fact when they learn that phosphorus is a planet, but actually they knew that all along. They just learned it in a new way, as it were. So maybe Mary's kind of like that. Even in her room, she actually does know what it's like to see the color red. But she only knows that fact under like a scientific-y description, or from like a third personal vantage point. Once she finally experiences red, though, she understands that very same fact under just a more like introspective or first person perspective. And so actually we just have one fact here known in two different ways. And so we don't need to posit some like non-physical fact in addition to the physical facts she knew. So she actually did know what it's like to see red, just under a different description or from a different vantage point or in a different way.
If I could just jump in here, I think that's an excellent suggestion. We might need to move on to an argument for physicalism after this, but just to maybe sketch a non-physicalist response. Here's a claim that seems crude to me in general. So whenever you know one fact under a guise, but don't know that fact under a different guise or description or conceptualization or way, and as Joe was saying, seems like in all of those cases you're missing some other fact, some linking fact, some fact that links the two descriptions into one fact. And so in the example of Hesperus and phosphorus, what you're missing is some linking fact that links the two descriptions together. So for example, it might be that you're missing the linking fact that there's one object or one planet that both descriptions are about. And in the case of Mary, what I want to say is, okay, if it's really true that Mary knows the facts about color under a scientific description, but not under an experiential description, then it must be that there's some linking facts in between that she's missing. But then, if you accept the stipulations of the case, that Mary knows all of the physical facts, then it looks like the only type of fact that this linking fact could be is a non-physical fact, because she doesn't yet know it. And so, I want to suggest that if you accept the stipulations of a case, then you have to accept that there's this further linking fact, and because it can't be a physical fact, Mary knows all of the physical facts, there has to be at least one non-physical fact. But if that's true, then physicalism is false. It might be that we've heard a lot of praise for dualism, but maybe we want to hear something from the physicalists.
That's fair. I mean, I think that's a reasonable response, and maybe we can talk about that
in
later.
the Q&A. Yeah.
Right, in the Q&A if you want. But yeah, let's go to an argument for physicalism. So this is called the causal exclusion argument. So the argument relies on the following principle. It's called the causal closure principle. And it says that every physical event involved in human behavior and brain processing can be fully causally explained by prior physical causes. So we ask, why did my arm go up? Well, we can give a complete causal explanation of that in terms of prior physical causes, right? Like muscles were contracting and various neurons were firing, and then trace that back to my motor cortex. Neurons were firing there. That was caused by the previous state of the universe and so on. It seems like there's no point in the physical processes involved in physical behavior and brain processes where we need to kind of like reach outside of the physical domain and appeal to something non-physical in order to give a complete explanation of human behavior and brain processing. And I think this causal closure principle, that every physical event involved in human behavior and brain processing, is it fully causally explained by prior physical causes? I think that's really well motivated as just a pretty solid generalization of what we know from science. It explains really nicely the progress of neuroscience in uncovering neuroscientific bases for our behavior, of our feelings, of our emotions, and so on. It also meshes really well with physics. Like physics is providing us this unified picture of reality where all atoms, regardless of where they are, if they're in the Andromeda galaxy or in a brain, they obey the same physical equations. They're governed by the laws of physics. They undergo physical interactions, and we can explain those interactions in purely physical terms. So I think this principle of causal closure is really well motivated from the success of neuroscience in finding fully adequate physical causal explanations of our behavior, but also just from the success of physics. And if you disagree, it seems like you're betting against physics. It seems like you're saying, oh, no. When atoms are caught up in brains specifically, they swerve differently than how the physical laws would predict, and that seems kind of odd. Okay, so I think this causal closure principle is just extremely plausible. But given this causal closure principle, the dualist faces a pretty serious dilemma. And either option that they take of the dilemma just spells complete disaster for dualism. So if we accept causal closure, we should reject dualism, and we should accept causal closure, so we should reject dualism. Okay, so what's that dilemma? Well, the dilemma is that either mental events, like experiences of pain, have physical effects, or they don't. It's extremely implausible to say that they don't have physical effects, right? I mean, like, surely, for instance, my pain causes me to say, like, ow, you know, when I stub my, that wasn't my toe. When I hit my hand, you know, and it hurt, when I stub my hand, it seems like the pain causes me to say, ow, and ask for a Band-Aid, and, you know, look for my mother for comfort. But it's also extremely implausible, given causal closure. Okay, so actually, let me say, dualists should not go down that horn of the dilemma, where mental events, like pain, have no physical effects whatsoever. That just seems wrong. Like our beliefs and our desires, they explain our behavior. Pain explains our behavior. So does pleasure, and so on. They have causal influences over our behavior. So the dualist should not go down that horn of the dilemma. That would be disastrous. But what about the other horn of the dilemma, where the dualist says that mental events do have physical effects? That also seems extremely implausible. And the reason is that given causal closure, for the dualist to say that mental events do have physical effects, well then, whenever a mental event produces a physical effect, there's already a distinct physical event, in addition to the mental event, which is fully sufficient for that physical effect, and which already adequately explains it. And so mental events on this picture turn out to just be entirely redundant in explaining human behavior. Because again, given causal closure, there's already a fully adequate physical causal explanation of brain processes and human behavior. And if the dualist is positing some additional non-physical mental cause in addition to those physical effects, which is causing the exact same effects, it seems like mental events are rendered redundant, and that seems really implausible. It also seems, and you know, that seems implausible also for the reason that it just seems like our experiences play like an indispensable role in explaining some of our behaviors, whereas that's not the case under this picture. You know, even if we didn't have those experiences, the physical events would have played out in exactly the same way. So you're kind of losing the explanatory oomph of appeals to mental events and explaining human behavior. I mean, there's also the fact, I think, that if you posit that there are like fully distinct, fully sufficient causes for physical events involved in human behavior and brain processing, this is called systematic overdetermination. Now, that's a very, very fancy word, but that basically just means physical events involving human behavior and brain processing regularly have two completely distinct kinds of fully sufficient causes. But if you posit that sort of thing, that involves a really striking and really implausible coincidence just like across the board, because it means that there are like widespread and repeated confluences of like fundamentally different causes just always somehow training on the exact same effects. And that seems really unlikely. It seems really implausible. You know, in everyday cases, when we have two fully distinct, fully sufficient causes for one effect, like when, you know, 10 sharpshooters all shoot me at the same time, they're all distinct causes, like that's a really rare occurrence, and it requires like a lot of harmonious confluences among events. But with the dualist picture, if you accept this kind of overdetermination picture where mental events do cause physical effects, then given causal closure, you are positing this widespread, systematic overdetermination. And that seems to just be like, just this systematic, super implausible coincidence across the entire domain of human behavior. And that seems extremely implausible. So again, either horn of the dilemma here seems really bad. If you say mental events have physical effects, then you get this widespread overdetermination, which seems like it involves crazy coincidences, and it also just renders appeals to mental events redundant in explaining human behavior. So that seems really bad. And if you say that mental events don't have any physical effects, that just seems ludicrously false. And so the dualist is kind of, you know, caught between a rock and a hard place. I mean, either way you go, it's really bad, if you accept causal closure. And remember, there are very good reasons to accept causal closure, as I said, that causal closure principle. So, since causal closure is true, dualism must be false. That's the basic gist of the argument.
Wow. Well, I agree that it would be bad to deny that our mental states have physical effects. I think the famous philosopher of mind, Jerry Fodor, once said, "If my beliefs don't literally cause my actions, then everything I believe is false and it's the end of the world." So I agree with Fodor about that, and I also agree that overdetermination is weird and spooky and bad. So I don't like the horns of this dilemma, but I don't think the case for causal closure is as strong as you think it is. I mean, science hasn't proven that causal closure holds. Maybe in general, physical events have physical causes, right? Dualists aren't disputing that. Almost anywhere you look, physical events will have sufficient prior physical causes, but not everywhere that you look. And in particular, where minds are involved, we think causal closure is not going to hold. But I think it would be too hasty to say that neuroscientists have reached such a detailed understanding of the workings of the brain that they know that there's no non-physical shenanigans going on. You know, like, maybe they just haven't watched the brain closely enough. And also, like, here's something to keep in mind. Maybe it's true that everywhere neuroscientists have looked, they haven't found evidence of the influence of a non-physical soul. But also, there might be a selection effect going on here, because neuroscientists, when they look at brain processes, are looking for their physical causes. So obviously, they're going to look in those places where they're most likely to find physical causes. And when they discover physical causes, those are going to grab all the headlines, right? So it makes sense why every time we hear from neuroscientists, they're telling us about a new physical cause for some brain process. But I think that's just what we would expect, because that's what they're looking for. So I don't think the scientific evidence provides really strong support for causal closure, at least not nearly as strong as you think it does.
I'd just like to say, I think there's a bit more to be said in favor of causal closure. Just like how if we give it up, especially for the sake of accounting for consciousness, I think we end up with like just a really weird and complicated picture of the natural world. So in particular, so what does it mean to reject causal closure? Well, basically it means that like the atoms and particles in my brain, they sort of deviate from how they would move if they were being just determined by the physical laws. So it's almost like there has to be this kind of like new set of laws that also govern other parts of the universe, namely minds, and then how minds, or I should say souls, and how they interact with physical stuff, like the physical stuff in my brain. These would be so-called psychophysical laws, the laws for how the mental stuff and the physical stuff interacts with each other.
And you said that psychophysical laws. So psycho as in mental, and then physical as in the physical, and it's just governing the interaction between them.
Yeah, exactly. And then they determine when the atoms in my brain are going to move in a different way than they would if they were only subject to the physical laws. But yeah, I think if you really think about this picture, you end up with a view of reality that's just so grotesquely complicated. We have to like posit this whole new kind of fundamental law of nature, and the laws would be horrifically complex and radically unlike any other laws that we've ever scientifically discovered. And I have more support for that. So the reason I think that they'd be like hopelessly complicated is because whereas physical laws are, the math is hard, but they're relatively simple. They, give nice little equation for how the most fundamental elements of reality are going to develop over time. And then everything else we see just arises out of that, those fundamental laws governing all these little constituents of reality. But in the case of the psychophysical laws, they would apply to these like very high-level, complicated properties of some matter, like whole brains. It's like the individual particles are being governed by physical laws, but then, once they're all shaped like a brain, then the psychophysical laws jump in and start doing other stuff. So that's very different than the laws we actually have, once being sensitive to such high-level properties of arrangements of matter. And the psychophysical laws would also be really special in how just like isolated they are in space and time. So like the physical laws that we know about, they basically, I mean, there's still problems with reconciling quantum mechanics and general relativity, but, for the most part, they apply the same everywhere. In contrast, the psychophysical laws mainly just concern brains. So it's as if, the universe is going on and on and on for billions of years with no influence of the psychophysical laws. And for these billions of years, these psychophysical laws were just, standing up there, waiting at the wings, waiting for brains to develop so that they could finally jump in and pounce in and sprinkle consciousness on these newly developed brains. After billions of years, they finally get to jump in. And that's kind of whack. Yeah, and physicalism, I think, is overwhelmingly way more simple, way more natural. We just say that the particles that exist are governed by these relatively simple laws that apply the same everywhere, and all of the stuff that we see with consciousness and all that, those are just very high-level interactions between the particles under physical laws. It seems like a more simpler and more likely picture of reality.
Yeah, I think just to jump in, I want to make a, grotesquely obsequious and horrifically groveling type of conception. I did any interesting view in philosophy is probably going to have to bite some bullets. I mean, it was agreed that the non-physicalist responses to the Mary's Room called experiment, maybe they work, but they don't seem like initially the most natural ones to take. They're a little counterintuitive. And I'm going to try and get the physicalist side to bite even more bullets in this debate. But this is a bullet that I think both of us happen to bite, right? So with Noah, I agree that we don't want to say that the physical causes and the mental causes sort of fully overdetermine one another, making the mental causes explanatorily redundant, right? That's whack. And I also want to say that the idea that mental events don't cause physical events. I mean, put down the crack pipe. But just to stick up for the causal closure just a little bit. It's true, I think, that we're going to have to shoulder some costs. So we're going to have to grant that there's a new set of laws in our theory that the physicalist side don't have. And that involves adding complexity to our theory, and we grant that, and it's an unfortunate cost. But sometimes you need to just add things to your theory in order to explain the data in question, and that's what we think we're doing. Additionally, for anyone who is here for the "Is there a God" debate at the Princeton session, seems like a lot of the spookiness that Flo pointed out, and I agree it sounds initially spooky, just kind of evaporates if you've adopted something else that's fairly spooky in your theory to begin with, namely God, right? So, yeah, no, it's kind of weird to have these psychophysical laws that are waiting in the wings, where like nobody put them there, and then they pounce as soon as matter forms itself into something like a brain. But if you think there's a God, it ceases to be like especially puzzling why these laws would end up being very complicated, and also why they might just like pounce later once brains have developed. Like God just might develop some complex psychophysical laws because that's how you get minds as complex as ours, and then he'd have them ready to pounce. So he put them in the wings; they weren't just there randomly. And so if you're strongly inclined towards naturalism, then I think there's going to be some pressure in your worldview.
True naturalism.
Just to define what I mean by naturalism. Naturalism is it's a bit like atheism plus, right? So it denies that there's a God, but it also denies that there's anything especially spooky, such as ghosts or souls, or lots of other immaterial things of that nature. And so I think if you're a committed naturalist, you're going to feel some strong pressure to deny the theory that we're defending, namely that we're bodies and souls. But I think if you're a theist, it's really no problem at all. And if you find the arguments for dualism compelling tonight, I think that should put pressure on you to move towards theism or something like it. So I won't pretend that these views are entirely independent of one another, even though logically they are.
That just means that
Yeah.
they don't like strictly entail one
Yeah.
another, but they like mesh nicely together. That's
Yeah,
what I mean.
it sort of fits into a more satisfying picture of the world, even though there's no logical incompatibility between being a theist materialist or between being someone who believes in souls and who's an atheist. And by the way, there are philosophers who believe in souls and yet are atheists. Why am I accepting this course? Well, like, I just think that you need souls in particular, not just non-physical consciousness, but souls, in order to give a remotely satisfying theory of personal identity over time. Would you mind if I just say a little bit about that?
Yes, I think this is your guys' second argument, right?
Yeah. I mean, and that seems like a natural thing.
That's
Even though we just kind of conceded that, you've made a dent in our view. Okay. So here's something that I don't think the opposition will want to deny. They exist, and they were once free. Okay.
3 years old.
3 years old. Yeah. Right, I think everyone in this room probably agrees that they exist and they were once 3 years old, but it turns out to be very philosophically puzzling as to, what could make that so. The soul theory gives a really neat picture of how that works. You are numerically identical to a soul. A soul is an immaterial thinking thing that has a two-way causal interaction with the brain. And so you exist so long as your soul exists. You go where your soul goes. Because the soul can't be like physically divided, it ends up running into many fewer puzzles than the materialist pictures of personal identity. Let me just run through kind of like 3 traditional materialist or physicalist theories of personal identity and why I think they don't work. And maybe they'll want to supplement one of them and say something more in a moment. So one tempting thought is that what makes you the same person over time is a kind of like chain of overlapping psychological traits like your memories or your personality or your character, things of that nature. And obviously that's important for, one sense of who you are as a person. But I want to claim like reducing your identity to these psychological properties, it's going to have some very puzzling consequences. Consider a boy who becomes a soldier, who then later in life, at the age of 40, say, becomes a general, okay? And imagine that all they're thinking is that to be the same person over time, you need to, your memories need to kind of like overlap in a continuous way over time, right? So, the boy, the soldier remembers being flogged as a boy, and so we can say on this theory, yes, the soldier is the same person as the boy. And, the general remembers taking the stand and becoming a soldier. And so we could say, yes, the general is the same person as the soldier. But the thing about identity, numerical identity, one-to-one identity, is that it needs to be transitive, right? Like if A is identical to B and B is identical to C, then A is going to be identical to C. But it turns out transitivity might not be satisfied in this case, right? So it could be that the soldier remembers being flogged as a boy and the general remembers becoming a soldier, but that the general, by the time he's 40, has forgotten being flogged as a boy. And so it looks like, while the soldier is the same person as the boy and the general is the same person as the soldier, on this theory, the general is not the same person as the boy. And that seems like a bizarre result. And so we don't get the result that you existed when you were 3. If you've like forgotten all the stuff that happened when you were 3, but remembered when you were 7, let's say. A different thing you might take is you might say, okay, you are a biological organism. You are just the fleshy monstrosity that you see every day in the mirror. Yeah. What's wrong with this theory? Well, I get it, it's very tempting to say, I'm an animal, right? And in a sense, I agree that's true. But, okay, imagine the case like this. Imagine that a neuroscientist carefully, removes the top of your skull and takes your brain and puts it in the eagerly awaiting skull of another body, okay? Intuitively, where do you think you would go? So, suppose that the scientist keeps the rest of the organism alive with, various wires and such. Well, the majority of the organism is still with the body, right? And so it makes sense to say, like, that's where the organism is, just one part of it, the brain, is over there. But if you say that you are your body, then you have to say that, like, you're there as opposed to going where your brain goes. And that seems like a really bad result, because presumably the person in the other body is going to wake up, have your memories. They're definitely going to think that you're you, and this is just like a mindless body being stimulated by wires.
And in fact, you said they wake up. Perhaps they don't even put you to sleep with this. Like, you could even maintain your conscious experience, and then at some point, you lose your vision because you're no longer connected to eyes. But you might be thinking, I wonder when they're going to put me in my new body.
As you can tell, the physicalists won't be defending this one.
Yes, the physicalists reject this view. So.
Okay, and finally, like, you might say, okay, well, a different view could explain why you go where your brain goes, namely that you are your brain, and I agree that's a better view to have, but I think it's really going to run into some problems. So I think another constraint on theories of personal identity that we want is that there always needs to be like a determinate fact about whether you exist. Okay, so. It can't be that, it just like, at sometimes it's like indeterminate or vague whether you're around. It's like, no, like you either exist or you don't. And imagine a case like this. So sometime in the future, neuroscientists will probably just be able to like split the brain, take the two halves apart, and then relocate those halves in two different eagerly awaiting bodies. Okay? And they're both gonna wake up and claim to be you, and they're gonna have your apparent memories. But they can't both be you, right? Because like one of them could die, and you can't, while the other lives, and you can't like both die and be alive at the same time, right? But if the two halves of the brain, it contain just as much relevant information, and we can imagine that they contain exactly the same number of atoms, they managed to do this really precisely. It just seems like there's nothing about the brains that could determine where you go. In contrast, on the soul theory, where you go is just determined by which brain continues to harbor your soul. And while I don't claim to have an answer about which would harbor your soul, and I don't claim that I claim that's not a problem with the view. There are some things we just couldn't know in principle. There's still an explanation on the dualist account of how there could be a fact of the matter about where you go. And I claim on the brain theory, there just isn't.
That makes my brain hurt. Oh no, you hurt.
Yeah, now you hurt.
Yeah. So I'm really sympathetic to your critiques of the second two personal identity views. And yeah, the kind of view that I'm most inclined to accept is sort of like one of the psychological continuity theories. I think, there's better versions than Locke's. I really like the one given by Derek Parfit. So, he sort of, he doesn't so much model being the same person as a sort of just identity relationship. He treats it as sort of like another kind of relationship. So, you stand in a certain amount of psychological relatedness to, like, say, yourself when you were 3 years old. And that's not an all or nothing thing. What's special about, like, me that makes me the same person as I am when I was 3 years old is that, this tiny slice of flow is, like, the most psychologically connected being to 3-year-old flow. And moreover, I am also sufficiently psychologically connected over the sort of big series of overlapping memories, that I count was the same person. So it's sort of like, let's say you saw a 3-year-old Flo. I was very cute. And then you go in a coma, and then you wake up in 26 years, and then you're like, I wonder where that really smart and cute kid is. Wonder how they're doing now. So what you might do if you're a Parfidian, and you believe his theory of personal identity, you might look for the person in the world, if such exists, who is sufficiently psychologically connected to 3-year-old Flo, in the sense of like having a similar character, similar memories. Maybe I don't have any memories in common with 3-year-old Flo, but there's at least some chain of sort of psychological overlap that traces back to 3-year-old Flo. And then, once you find me and you see that I am very psychologically continuous 3-year-old Flo, you'll also notice there's nobody else who's remotely this psychologically continuous with 3-year-old Flo. And so Parfitian is going to say, yes, it is the 29-year-old version of 3-year-old Flo. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
If you just want to restate it before you criticize it.
Yeah, sure. I mean, so like the view is going to be that so in the sort of Lockean view, or the view that's attributed to Locke, you sort of had this like overlapping chain of memories, and that's an essential part of the view. But on this view, for one person, person X, to be the same person as like a prior person, person Y. They just need to be like the best candidate, the most psychologically linked up to X out there. And so if that condition is met, then you count as the same person. And so, yeah, I agree. This won't run into the same problem as the Lockean or allegedly Lockean view that I was critiquing earlier. And I also want to say, I think this is by far the best version of the psychological continuity theory on the table. But what I like about the dualist theory is I think it can satisfy all of the intuitively plausible constraints that you want to have on a theory of personal identity. In particular, one constraint that the dualist or soul theory satisfies, and that Parfit's theory violates, in my opinion, and I'd be interested to hear what Flo thinks, is the so-called intrinsicality condition on personal identity. I'll explain what that is with a thought experiment that actually comes from Parfit. Right, so Parfit is famous for having come up with something called the teletransporter case. And what happens in that case is that you step into a teletransporter. And what that's going to do is it's going to just dissolve your body. But as it does so, it's going to make a perfect atom-for-atom copy of it. It's then going to send that information all the way onto another planet on the other side of the universe. And then a machine waiting on the other side is going to essentially 3D print a perfect replica, which includes all of the psychological properties. So it's going to be a perfect psychological duplicate of the one that was destroyed back on Earth. Okay? And so in that case, what Parfit wants to say is that you travel all the way over to that other planet because that person on the other end is the most psychologically continuous person to the person who was dissolved on Earth. But imagine a twist on the case. Right? So imagine that the machine on Earth malfunctions. So it copies your body, it sends the information over to the other planet. On the other planet, they 3D print the body. But the machine on Earth fails to destroy the body that stepped into the machine, such that you now have two people. You both seem to have like an equally good claim on Parfit's theory to be you. They're both equally psychologically connected. And what Parfit does is he adds what I think is a fairly ad hoc restriction. What he says, he adds what's called the no duplicates condition, where there's that. The theory works, but just like not in that case. So you would go over to the other planet under normal circumstances, but if there happens to be this other person on the other side of the universe on Earth who continues to exist, then that person doesn't go over to the other planet. And I think this view violates the intuition that whether and where you exist isn't going to depend on whether there's just like some other person on some other corner of the universe who happens to be psychologically identical with you. Something else needs to be determining that fact. It seems really weird for like whether and where you exist to be determined by something so extrinsic to you, such as just another body on another planet. Does that objection make sense?
Yeah, do you want to end that? Or was
Okay, yeah. I'm perfectly happy with that way of putting it. Couldn't have said it better myself.
So, I mean, this is maybe a case where us physicalists might have to bite a bullet. Yeah, but it's only a teeny tiny one. And it's definitely not like positing these ludicrous psychophysical laws that are completely unlike any other laws and which sort of like wait in the wings, ready to pounce and springs the consciousness around.
In a very whack manner.
In a very whack manner. So the reason why I think biting the bullet here and just accepting this, that personal identity is extrinsic, the reason why I think that that's not too much of a cost is that this thought experiment is just so far removed from our ordinary, humdrum, everyday experience. And we shouldn't expect our intuitions about personal identity to be reliable in such like hopelessly extravagant, far out cases. And I mean, we can even bring in like evolution at this point. Like, evolution cares only about survival and reproduction. It doesn't really care about giving us true beliefs about these like metaphysical intuitions about what happens in super crazy teletransporter cases. And so it seems like we shouldn't even expect our intuitions about these really highfalutin, abstract philosophical matters to be reliable. It seems like evolution gives us reason to think that they're not. And I just, in general, counterexamples like this, or problems like this, which rely on super far removed, remote, kind of hard to imagine cases, shouldn't be particularly evidentially salient or evidentially probative. It seems, yeah, maybe it's a somewhat of a cost to bite the bullet and accept a slightly unintuitive result, but it doesn't seem to be too significant of a cost, just for those two reasons. The fact that the case is so far removed from ordinary experience, and secondly, evolution, it seems, gives us reason to think that our intuitions here wouldn't even be reliable in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, just to kind of meta commentary on that, the force of an argument is going to vary from person to person. Like sometimes an intuition just strikes one person as stronger than it does another, and for that person, they're going to have more reason to reject a given theory.
I should interject. I'm sorry. We're using the term intuition. That just means like the way something seems to you upon reflection. So we might have like an intuition that personal identity is not extrinsic. Instead, it's an intrinsic matter, which is brought out by the teletransporter case that Amos brought up. An intuition is just like, yeah, reflecting on that case, how do things seem to you? Like, what's the right result? Yeah, it just seems really plausible that a personal identity is intrinsic. So that's what we mean by an intuition. It's just that state in which something seems to you to be the case.
Yeah, and so, insofar as you don't find it that counterintuitive, that, whether you go to the other planet could depend on something so extrinsic as, whether there's another person on the other side of the universe who has your psychological properties. That will vary from person to person. For me, it doesn't seem like it would be a small bullet to bite. It just seems totally whack. But I can see how it very robust to person. That's probably all I had to say. We've all bitten some bullets in this debate. We've accepted that our theory is sort of, has to posit some extra laws. That hurts the simplicity of the theory. We think they're needed to explain various things, such as, very plausible, I think, judgments about personal identity. The other side will have to sort of bite the bullet in Parfit's case about the teletransporter, maybe accept some sort of counterintuitive diagnoses of what's going on in the marigold experiment. So you can see just like how, in an interesting debate like this, everyone is going to have to shoulder some costs, and it's about who can have the best theory or overall, or who can have a theory that has no objections to its name.
You do have one other argument for physicalism. Noah, did you have anything to add on that before we turn to that argument, or should we just go to the argument?
I'm good. Let's.
Okay.
And yes, just sort of to add on to Joe, I do feel really comfortable sort of having these somewhat counterintuitive conclusions when it comes to Mary's room and personal identity, because, physicalism seems just so overwhelmingly likely to me, given just sort of the scientific evidence we have today. That brings me to sort of the second argument for physicalism. So, before we had so much great science that gave us iPhones and all that, we didn't understand the world very well. And so we very often posited supernatural explanations for things. We appealed maybe to Demas to explain mental illness, or we appealed to sort of like the rain god to explain like why we didn't have a good harvest one year, and so on. But the more we discover about the empirical world and about the physical world, the more it seems like those supernatural explanations just go away. They become unnecessary. And, that seems to always have been the trend up to this point, and I just strongly expect it to continue. So, here's like one case for comparison. Consider the concept of life. So, back in the day, there used to be a big debate about between people who thought that life, including plants and so on, about whether life is just material versus whether it is like a fundamentally different kind of thing from the material of physical. There were people who thought like, I just can't think of any way that you could like put a bunch of matter together and then it would make up something that is truly alive, like a plant. There has to be some like extra ingredient in there in order to explain like why it's living matter instead of dead matter. So some people postulated this vital force along vital in order to explain why some matter is alive and some matter is not alive.
And so elan vital just means vital.
Vital force. Yes, but also if you want to sound fancy. But then, once you got to this point, it doesn't seem very necessary to posit elan vital. We understand chemistry, on the molecular level very well. We understand how cells can do what they do, even though it's very complicated, and how they make up larger organisms that can do what they do, including, say, a plant. And so, now that we know more about the world, it seems like we don't need any kind of extra ingredient in reality or any supernatural explanation in order to know why something is alive. And it seems to me that we're in the exact same place when it comes to consciousness. We just haven't done all of the sort of neuroscientific investigation necessary for us to finally understand how a bunch of matter can come together and still have subjective experience. But it seems like, we're on a promising trajectory in that regard. For pretty much every sort of behavior we have that we've been able to scientifically study, and this goes back to the previous points a little bit, it seems like we've been really productive at finding out physical causes for them. So, for example, various abilities we have in terms of certain functioning in certain regions of the brain, and so on. And, the sorts of discoveries we have made seems like exactly what you would expect if you think that consciousness just emerges from the physical mind. And, so for that reason, I think we have strong empirical reason to expect that the simpler theory of physicalism will eventually progress so that it'll make sense to us that consciousness can arise out of just matter.
Yeah, and if I can add to that a little bit. I think a good phrase here is track record. Physicalism just has such a great track record throughout the entire history of human investigation. Go back thousands of years, as you said. We posited all sorts of non-physical causes to explain things that we didn't understand. As you said, like the sun god to explain why the sun revolves around, like Thor and Zeus to explain lightning strikes or whatever, demons to explain mental illness and various other things. But these non-physical explanations have systematically, one by one, gone by the wayside as scientific progress marches on. We have come to basically completely render all of those appeals to non-physical entities, every single one in the history of humankind, have been systematically discarded in favor of physical scientific explanations. And yet you guys are saying, oh, no, we're trying to hold on to this one place where it definitely can't happen. Look at the track record. Look at the evidence. The inductive evidence tells strongly in favor of physicalism. Science is going to march on. Physics is going to march on. Neuroscience is going to march on. And we have extremely good reason from that track record and from this inductive generalization that that's going to happen in the case of consciousness. So I think we should accept physicalism on the basis of this extremely strong track record.
Well, good luck with that. Yes, there's only one non-physical entity under discussion, and that's consciousness. And we just deny that neuroscience has marched on to explain consciousness. Certainly, neuroscience is very helpful in learning various facts about how consciousness works, even getting us closer to learning about the nature of the psychophysical laws. We just think that there are in principle philosophical reasons to think that consciousness will resist this kind of explanation. Right, so we grant it was a mistake for people who are not us to posit Elandertal and to say there was this speckled kind of life force in plants. But we deny that they had any good philosophical arguments for thinking that in principle that was the only kind of explanation on offer. But we think that the arguments that we mentioned earlier, Mary's room argument against physicalism, and then the personal identity argument specifically for dualism, having the best theory of personal identity over time, these sorts of arguments will need to be overcome if we're to think that science has a hope of explaining consciousness all on its own. And so, whether this point is successful, I think just kicks back to the earlier disputes we were having about the arguments for dualism.
Here's maybe an analogy we could use. For much of human history, human beings believed that the natural world was the product of design by a masterful engineer, namely God. But, since biologists have made a lot of progress in explaining many of those apparently designed features of the natural world in terms of mindless processes like evolution through natural selection. So you could say science has the anti-design hypothesis has a very good track record, right? We have thousands and thousands of examples where we've shown that, this thing that we thought was designed, in fact, isn't designed. But there still are some things that are designed, like this pen. I know this pen is designed. I have very good reason to think that this pen is designed, and no evolutionary biologist is never going to make a discovery that shows that, this pen just like sprouted out of the ground somewhere. So the point is just that, it might be that physicalism has a good track record in some areas, but you can't extrapolate from its track record in those areas to success in all areas, because there might be some areas where we just have really excellent reason to think that those physical explanations aren't going to turn up in the same way. I know that Darwinian explanations of human artifacts like a pen, those just aren't going to turn up. So I think that's more like the situation we're in. I do grant, yeah, physicalism is true of lots of things, like physicalism about lightning. Thumbs up. It's a very well supported.
When you say physical is about lightning, you just mean like
Lightning.
all the facts about lightning can be captured in terms of the language of physics and scientific explanation.
Exactly. Physicalism is true about the lightning.
It's like a restricted version of physicalism, because technically speaking, physicalism, as we've defined it, says everything is physical. I just don't want people to get confused.
Yeah. They're pretty smart. I think they. But
My YouTube viewers might not. No, I'm kidding all.
Anyway, so I concur with Amos's verdict.
Well, one thing that I want to say in response to that is, point taken, that we can't deduce that physicalism will then also therefore must be true about the brain. But again, it's an inductive argument. That just means, it doesn't mean that the conclusion doesn't strictly logically follow inescapably from the premises, but the premises do nevertheless give us good reason to accept the conclusion. Sure, maybe you have overwhelming evidence against that conclusion, so you ultimately reject it. That's okay. But still, it's hard to see how you could deny that we nevertheless have some weight of a reason to think that physicalism is going to be true about conscious experience and minds, given that it has been true about basically about everything else that people have posited non-physical things to account for. So take the pen example. Suppose you had no background information about pens. And, you go onto a planet which has pens and other life forms, and again, you never see anything about pens or anything like pens. And you come up with a theory of evolution about all the life forms on that planet, and then you're like, okay, yeah, all the life forms on this planet came about as a result of purely physical processes, not designed or anything like that. And then you come across the pen. Again, absent the background information, absent overwhelming evidence that you mentioned in favor of thinking that the pen was designed, given that everything else on this planet was the result of mindless physical processes, it seems like you should at least have some reason to think that this was also a result of mindless physical processes.
Maybe some reason, but
it's in principle liable to be defeated by countervailing considerations. So you can there are considerations that it could overturn that, but it still gives us some reason to think that it's the case.
I think we're definitely going to agree. I mean, how could we not? If all we had to go on was the success of physicalism in domains outside of the thing that we're having a debate about, then of course you should think probably physicalism is true of the thing we're having a debate about as well. But I think the very reason we're having a debate about it is because we think that there are at least prima facie credible considerations that I think everyone across the debate could agree with that make physicalism a really puzzling view. And so, we grant that, of course, the success of physicalism in other domains is some evidence against dualism. But, we think the really interesting points of engagement, given that we both agree about that, is about success of the arguments for dualism. And so that's really what the debates will ultimately hinge on.
And here's an important meta point, is that, when you're having a philosophical discussion, if you want it to be productive, you should be willing to say that your opponent's arguments have some force.
We often
do, right? Because sometimes, there are forceful arguments even for views that turn out to be wrong. So we don't want to be so adamant that we just deny that our opponent's arguments have any value. We don't have to do that to maintain our own views for the reasons that Amos just explained.
And that also helps curb a kind of dogmatic overconfidence in your views, to recognize that, listen, there are reasonable arguments against some of the views that you have, and it can help you get a little bit of intellectual empathy for people who are on the other side of the debate. They might be seeing things differently than you. They might have different intuitions, different arguments are informing their view of which you might not be aware. So that's why intellectual empathy is very important, just being able to see things through other people's perspective, not automatically inferring that people who disagree with you are irrational or bad or something like that. Okay, well that concludes our debate on whether we have a soul.